Okay, so I'm here on behalf of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. I'm a compassion-focused psychotherapist with a background in anthropology. I've been working as a psychotherapist for about 8 years, and I'm here kind of to talk today about what we mean by a compassionate mind approach, and thinking about what we mean by compassion and how it can be helpful for us. Okay, so this is the boring legal bit. So that's a copyright the Compassionate Mind Foundation and Paul Gilbert. I'm sure I don't need to say that. Okay. Right, so firstly, compassion, this word compassion. I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with this term, and it can mean different things in different contexts, but it's a term that's kind of quite typical within our everyday language. And what's important is that it has a long history of a way in which a motive of how we address suffering. So it comes from, this understanding that, life is inherently full of suffering. And how do we as human beings kind of address, make sense, and work with that? So a really kind of useful from an academic perspective is this recent paper by Strauss et al. That says, there are a range of definitions from Buddhist and Western psychological perspectives, and 5 components of compassion were identified. So there's a recognition of suffering, an understanding of its universality. So we all suffer, obviously in different ways and to different degrees, but there is this universality of suffering within the human experience. There's also recognition of feeling sympathy, empathy, or concern for those who are suffering, which they describe as emotional resonance, a tolerating of the distress associated with the witnessing of suffering. Understandably, suffering brings up all kinds of different kind of feelings and responses, but the ability to tolerate the distress that it can bring is important. But also a motivation to act or acting to alleviate that suffering. Each of these components has been articulated by several published definitions of cognition, although no single existing definition explicitly includes all 5 of them. But this is just to give you a sort of a taste, if you like, of some of the key features that people have recognized as being part of compassion. Okay, so within compassion-focused therapy, we would see compassion basically as a sensitivity to the suffering of self and others, with a deep commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. And from this, we identify 2 specific, what we call psychologies. So the first psychology is the ability to understand, approach, and engage with suffering. This, of course, involves courage. And one thing I think that's important to mention is that you hear a lot of, and there are a lot of popular kind of representations of compassion, is that it's just about being kind. There's nothing wrong with kindness, I would say, but it's just about being nice. It's a bit soft. It's not really, it's okay if you kind of a very fluffy, emotional person, but really it's kind of fluffy, sort of weak, sort of airy-fairy thing. And we would argue that that's absolutely not the case. In fact, the ability to understand, approach, and engage with suffering, really engage with suffering, takes a great deal of courage. And that's quite important. But we do need to be able to understand what suffering is in order to engage with it, of course. The second psychology is the dedication to work to alleviate that suffering, uproot its causes, and prevent future suffering. So that's also incredibly important. And this takes dedication and wisdom. So one thing that's important is that, and being able to understand, approach, and engage with suffering, that's the first step. But we kind of do need to know what's going to be helpful. We need to kind of know what to do to help to alleviate suffering and to help as much as we can, of course, to prevent future suffering. So we notice, approach, and engage in suffering in self and others, and that's important, in ourselves and for others, and then work to try to alleviate and prevent it. So we look at that in a slightly, in the way that compassion-focused therapy would see this is that it's a basic algorithm. So a compassion-focused therapy approach is one that's influenced by evolutionary theory. It's what, within therapy term, I won't get too much into that, it's what we would call a conciliant integrative approach. So we've drawn on a lot of different insights from a lot of different disciplines, because we recognize that there's wisdom everywhere. So there's wisdom in, you know, people's experiences, and there's wisdom in different ways of making sense of what it is to be human. And we try and kind of draw out all of the wisdom from all of those different perspectives to kind of inform what it is that we're doing. But one of the things that we would see is that, you know, compassion it works as what we'd call an algorithm, because it's a response to a stimulus. So going back to this sense, right, that it's a sensitivity to the suffering or distress of self and others with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. So firstly, this involves what we call stimulus detection and engagement. That sounds very kind of sciencey, doesn't it? But, you know, so if we see suffering or distress as a stimulus, then we use our courage to approach, understand, and engage with that. So there's the stimulus is the suffering, and the response is engaging with that, trying to understand it. So we go towards suffering rather than away. And then, of course, there's also taking action, because, of course, that I think something that's useful to point here is that the thing is that on its own, understanding or approaching suffering is important, but we need to kind of know what to do. So a really popular example is if you go to see, you know, a doctor and you've got, you know, problem, you know, say you've damaged your arm or something, and your doctor is very empathic to that. I can see that you're in a lot of pain. I can see that you're in a lot of distress. That must be very hard for you. Okay, but if there's no, okay, but I want to know what to do. And how are you going to help me to sort out, how are you going to help me to fix this or deal with this? So it's important that the taking action part is also a part of this. And of course, each is more complex than it might at first seem. Okay, this is just kind of briefly to sort of touch on that a lot of of our understanding of compassion and how we can kind of use it to support our, you know, our minds and our bodies is through our understanding of attachment and affiliation, and our understanding of the evolution of attachment and affiliative behavior. Because what we found is that over thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years, we've evolved to have a very sensitive system, which includes a range of different feature detectors with neurophysiological systems, such as our ability to produce oxytocin in response to certain things. The vagus nerve, which is this wandering, vagus means wandering, nerve that goes down the back. If you're kind of interested in some of the kind of psychotherapy, sort of self-help stuff, you'll probably be quite familiar with polyvagal theory, or there's been a lot more talk now about how you get your vagus nerve turned on. But also our frontal cortex in particular is very sensitive to our social relationships and our what we call affiliative relationships. And we have here the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system that get switched on by various different things, and they will have different kind of impacts on the body. I won't go on too much about that because we're here a long time. But what we know is that when these different systems are activated, they help to, or they organize the mind to pay attention, process, and engage behaviors that can address suffering, regulate threat processing, and promote prosociality and well-being to self and others. So what's kind of interesting is that our bodies are very sensitive to the worlds, and obviously the worlds in which we live, but that we can kind of work with our bodies to kind of activate, if you like, we can focus our attention, we can engage in different processes that will help us to address suffering, that will help us to regulate the threats that we experience in our life, but also that can help us to become more pro-social. One of the major findings about the vagus nerve is its relationship to how we will engage in community, or how we engage within our relationship, how we engage with our relationships. So what we say is that compassionate training stimulates and strengthens these faculties and qualities of mind. So we have the potential, our bodies are hardwired in ways that can be very unhelpful, but they also give us the opportunity that we can strengthen them to kind of serve us better, if you like. So just briefly, what we've seen is, again, this is kind of taking an evolutionary approach, is that we've evolved our kind of mammalian ancestors, again, going back a mind-boggling thousands upon thousands of years ago. One of the things that distinguishes mammals in particular from other species is their care for their young. And of course, this is associated with caring for our young increases their chances of survival. And over time, that's what we find within our own physiology, is that, okay, we have, as I just mentioned, the vagus nerve, we have this ability for oxytocin. So you'll probably be familiar that, mothers, when they cuddle their babies, there's a release of oxytocin, which is known as the bonding hormone. There are also various neurocircuits within our brains, and of course epigenetics. So our genetics can actually be it can be kind of turned or turned off by various kind of experiences and relationships. But one of the things that's really important about human beings, is that we have developed, and as far as we know, this is not the same as other animal species, but we have developed something that's a knowing awareness. So we have ability to think. We can think about thinking. We can think about thinking about things. You get the picture. This has been incredibly advantageous for us in regards to the development of our species, but it does also have its complications, as I shall explain a little bit later. But certainly we have this capacity for knowing awareness. We can become aware that we are aware. And we also have the ability to become aware of potentially what's going on in our minds. We also have the development of empathic awareness, our ability to be able to understand what might be going on in the mind of somebody else, and to be able to feel what somebody else is suffering. So we have this ability to really be able to enter into the world of other people. And of course, there's something known as a knowing intentionality. So we can also be intentional in what it is that we want to do. We can be intentional in our behavior. And what we would say from this is that we can see that from this kind of, our inherited capacity for million caring has affected our brains and our bodies in different ways. The competencies of our minds have, sorry, my family, but all of these things kind of have helped kind of to kind of sow the seeds, if you like, for human compassion. And what really underpins a lot of this is the role of sentience, that we are aware of being aware. Okay. So pain and suffering then, in many traditions, there's a distinction between experiencing pain and misfortune and suffering and our psychological reactions to pain and suffering. Now, I think one thing that's important here is that our psychological reactions to the pain and suffering that we experience, they're understandable, right? That we have these reactions. But what some of the Buddhist traditions, for example, Devag, is that if we can sometimes get too caught up in our psychological reactions to pain and suffering in such a way that they cause us further pain and suffering, and that there may be some psychological reactions that really perpetuate that pain and suffering. So in Buddhism, this is linked to what's known as the Sutra of the Two Arrows. And some of you might be aware of this. So what's been argued in Buddhist traditions is that when we experience pain or misfortune or suffering, we're hit by two arrows. So the first arrow that we're hit with is the pain itself, but the second arrow that we're hit with is our response to that pain. Now, I always think it's important to say that it's not that the goal here is not that we should, that so long as we don't have a psychological reaction to suffering, that's okay. But it's really about how we work with that, because a lot of our psychological reactions will be that's how we are, that's what it is to be human. And what we would say within a compassion approach is that compassion addresses both. It addresses both of these. How do we work with both of these experiences? Okay. So another thing that's kind of quite important in our approach is the sense of it's not your fault. Now, what we mean by that is that this is kind of a foundation from which we work, in that for many of, as a therapist, many of the people that we work with, the people carry a lot of shame and guilt and disappointment and all kinds of things about who we are. But a lot of their beliefs around that can reflect the fact that I feel that I deserve this. I've done something wrong in some way, and this is my. But basically, I have some weak character traits, and I deserve this. But one of the things that we would say is that so much actually of what we experience is not our fault. And part of this is that none of us choose the bodies that we're born into. We don't choose our genetic inheritance or the environment that we develop and live within, but we have to live with this. And this is when some people talk about the genetic lottery, in the sense in which, you know, some of us will be born into environments that are very favorable to our development, that are, you know, in which we're nourished and nurtured and all of those kind of things. And some of us won't be. Some of us will be born into far more difficult environments. This isn't, we didn't choose this. So it's important, I think, to kind of have this as a basis, really, that, you know, we don't choose this. That's not our fault that we have the bodies or the brains, or, you know, the backgrounds that we have. That's important. One of the problems that we may face is that we may feel that we should be able to cope better. And of course, we're very sensitive to how we may exist in the mind of others. That's another kind of, I think, really important insight from lots of different disciplines and perspectives, of course, that we are social beings. Human beings are social. We generally do better within communities. What we're finding on the flip side of that is that when a lot of the studies around loneliness are showing that loneliness is actually a really serious health risk for individuals. It does not do people very well to spend all their time on their own. But of course, because we live in communities, we're also kind of, we're sensitive about how we are. And we certainly don't want to risk being excluded in any way. And that can have quite an important impact on how we feel about ourselves. But again, there's you know, another thing, I guess this is my anthropology coming in, my anthropological background coming in, because obviously I've studied lots of different societies over a number of years. And of course, we'll live within societies that have particular social norms. So some of the norms that we have in our society aren't necessarily the same in others. But of course, some societies will endorse particular physical aesthetics and ways of being. And it's important to kind of note societies have in their own ways evolved in different ways for different reasons, and not necessarily always in a way that's actually really helpful for us. And that's a topic for another time. But I think it's important to remember that in the West, you know, we're often really bombarded, and especially now that we have social media and things coming into our homes all the time, we're constantly wired to this constant kind of flow of information, people trying to attract your attention. You know, we're often bombarded with images of a particular kind of a healthy self. So the idea about what is considered to be socially desirable generally is associated with a particular kind of marketing. These are often images that actually are airbrushed and manipulated, so they're not even really images of a real person. I think that's important. But we're often kind of, you know, this is kind of as a particular image that's celebrated. But there's also this sense of being constantly stoic. And I think that's something about British society, the stiff upper lip, that's how you should be. You should be constantly stoic and all of so we have those kind of messages really are perpetuated within our culture a lot. And of course, we can have a real sense of shame and a loss of dignity when we suffer from major physical tragedies. And, you know, often it can feel within our societies that you know, if we're not able to be this, I personally think, impossible ideal, then we're kind of not as welcome perhaps as other people, which is just a terrible thing. But that we can carry this sense, if we don't measure up to what we feel we should do, we can really kind of feel that actually that's our fault. What we would say is that actually, no, let's look at the bigger picture in which we're living here. You know, you don't choose this. We don't choose our cultures. We don't choose our bodies, but we have to live with them as we are. But we don't have to kind of blame ourselves for things that really are not our fault. That's quite an important part of some of the work we do. Okay, but this I think is a really lovely quote that kind of captures this and our approach to compassion. So compassion is the acknowledgement that not all pain can be fixed or solved, but all suffering is made more approachable in a landscape of compassion. Compassion is a multi-textured response to pain, sorrow, and anguish. It includes kindness, empathy, generosity, and acceptance. The strands of courage, tolerance, equanimity are equally woven into the cloth of compassion. Above all, compassion is the capacity to open to the reality of suffering and to aspire to its healing. So I think this is quite important. One of the I think something that a compassion approach really encourages is this sense that we know that not all, this isn't, we know things can't be fixed and they can't be solved. But how do we work with what there is? So how do we turn to the reality of suffering? And that's, I think, another thing is the importance of wisdom. You know, so the problem is you go, you know, I'm going to fix all this, I'm going to solve all this, but you can't do that. So we need to know what is genuinely going to be most helpful for people to support them through whatever the challenges of their life are. Okay. So this is something known as the 3 types of affect regulation system. So what we mean here is that basically there are 3 main regulation systems within our brains that relate to our emotions and how our emotions kind of dominate. A really fantastic example of this that's really entertaining as well, I think, is the film Inside Out. I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's a popular film a while ago, in which you have a little girl who her kind of emotional life is represented by different figures that represent kind of anger and sadness and joy. And what you see is that depending on what's happening in her life, different things get into the driving seat. It's a really fantastic representation kind of how this works, you know, that we'll be aware that, you know, we can be in certain kind of moods, and the certain kind of moods that we're in will dictate to a degree how we experience or how we see things. So of course, there's a classic example is when anger gets in the driving seat and it puts her up to, and she gets very angry and she's argumentative, and, you know, and all the other joy and everything else kind of don't get a look in. It's kind of similar. So at the bottom here, we have what's known as the threat system. Now, we're hardwired to be threat focused. And one of the things that I always like to share with people I work with is, you know, I don't offer anger training workshops and I don't offer anxiety training workshops. And I don't do that because it would be silly, but also it's very unlikely anyone would take me up on that, because we don't need to learn how to be more anxious. Anxiety will happen whether you like it or not. It's automatic. And there's the anger as well, or generally, or I mean, of course, we may have problems. We may have repressed our anger for a long time and find it very difficult to get in touch with. But certainly, these kind of feelings are automatic. We don't need to train in them, and there's a reason for that, because, you know, being threat focused is very useful for us, you know, because we need to be able to defend ourselves. And again, we think about this in evolutionary terms, you know, it's better to avoid being lynched many times than to be lynched once. So better safe than sorry is advisable. The problem is, of course, now we're living in societies where we really don't need to worry about, you know, kind of a lion on our tails. And also the problem is of our ability to maintain ourselves through our thoughts in our threat systems. So basically the threat system is focused on keeping us safe, protecting us from danger. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with kind of fight, flight, or freeze. These tend to be typical responses to threat. This is both an activating and an inhibiting emotion regulation system. So it's an activating one, so it kind of turns us on in certain ways, but it also inhibits other kind of our ability to engage with other emotional systems. So it's like if you've ever seen the meerkat, and they do that, they sense danger, and, you know, you feel a threat in your body quite instantaneously. So hyper alert, you know, I'm purely focused on looking out for threat. That's kind of what it can often be like. But we also have what's known as the drive system. And this is when we're in kind of a more incentive and resource focused position. Because of course, you know, the problem is, okay, it's all very well to be threat focused, but if that's all that we do, that's probably not going to get us very far, because we wouldn't do very much. So we also need to have this system that is based on resource, you know, finding resources, getting resources. So this is when we experience wanting, pursuing, achieving, consuming. It's generally an activating it's an activating regulation system. So it's you know, drive tends to be, again, if you think about how your body feels in these different systems, you find threat is often can be quite like that, but drive is often more, you know, go get them kind of thing. So this is, the part of us that wants to drive us forward, that's excited, that experiences of vitality, all of those kind of things. But what we also have, okay, so if you look at both of these systems, then they're both activating systems. So they're both kind of quite sort of energy in some respects. But we also have this system which known as the soothing system, because we need something that's going to help us to regulate these other two, because otherwise we're just going to be kind of on the go all the time. So this area for rest and digest, this is this kind of one of the purposes of the soothing system. This is an area where we feel connected, we feel safe, we feel soothed. It's often associated with kind of we're not interested in pursuing resources. We're just content to be here right now. And of course, that's important in regards to, thinking about eating. It's important that, you don't eat a meal and then go for a run straight away. And we need to have time to kind of rest and digest. And we also find that this is something that we often we often learn in our earliest relationships with our caregivers. So for example, if a baby is distressed and the mother responds to that, picks up the baby and holds the baby, and that the mother's presence will soothe the baby. With my 5-year-old nephew, I'm quite familiar with if he hurts himself and he gets distressed, he'll come over to somebody for a hug and for some reassurance. And you can see him just settle down, and then he's able to go back and play. So this knowing as well that there's somebody there who will be a secure base and a safe haven, and is going to be able to soothe you is really important. But this is also something that we can self-soothe, and we can learn how to do that. Okay, I just need time. Right. Okay. One of the problems that we have is that, ideally, if these things are in balance, that's great. The vast majority of us, myself included, that is not the case. And so again, why do we need compassion? Well, because this is really tricky to deal with. So what we often find is that, that we can become very trapped within our threat system. And again, as I mentioned about this ability to think, so a really good comparison here is that, if an antelope, for example, suddenly realizes that they're under attack, they'll have a burst of adrenaline and they'll run off, really, so they're completely focused on getting away from the attack. They'll run off. When they're safe from the attack, they'll be able to go back to whatever they were doing, resting, digesting, hanging out, whatever it is that they're doing. And you'll see that their heart rate kind of decreases. Now, the problem for human beings is that we're able to think about the threat after it's happened. And what we find is that actually we can maintain ourselves in these high threat states by thinking about it. So, so, oh my God, but there might be 2 lions next week or tomorrow, and what would have happened if I hadn't got away? And so, and we're able to think about the threat over and over and over again. And a really important kind of finding is that, our thoughts can perpetuate the way our bodies respond to things. So, one of the things that's really kind of difficult is that you'll be aware that, if you had somebody who's shouting at you, your body's going to respond in a particular kind of way. But if you're shouting at yourself in your head, as we often do, because many of us struggle with a harsh self-critic, that is stimulating the same physiological systems within your body. So our thoughts, if we're not careful, can really keep us in these states, and they're not states that are ideally we're supposed to be in for long periods of time. But unfortunately, for many of us, we feel that this is probably where we're spending most of our time. And of course, we're very threat focused. We can become very disappointed. Disappointment can really trigger your threat system. Why am I not like this? Why can't I do this? Why haven't I scored on this test or whatever? So when they really dominate, what happens is that they make these two other systems, which can help to regulate this, really difficult to access. They sort of kind of dim them. This is why it's can be an inhibiting system. They kind of really turn them off. But that, I'm sure that you can kind of think of examples in which, that actually, if I get myself into a certain, if I'm very anxious, I can find it quite difficult to get out of that. But and my attention's often so focused on how do I avoid threat, and my anxiety is pumping along about that. So what I really need to do in those situations is to try and access the soothing system, because that's what's there to help just to settle my mind down, settle it, just calm myself down. But it is difficult. And I think that's the thing that we always keep, this is difficult, because we're working. I mean, we tend to refer to our brains as tricky brains in CFT. They're very well designed in some ways, not so well designed in other ways. They can be quite difficult to work with at times. Okay. So I shall go on to the final bit. So what's kind of one of the things that we would let's get this on. Okay. So we kind of recognize that there are multiplicities in the way that we experience life, and particularly that life's traumas and tragedies, of which, some of us will experience more of those than others, of course, and we experience different kind of traumas and different kinds of tragedies. But that our emotions can, if particular emotions really dominate in our kind of inner landscape, if you like, that they kind of affect how we are in the world. So one of the things is that, if you're thinking about kind of life difficulties, traumas and tragedies, and how they're, and what kind of emotional responses they will trigger, what we often say within compassion-focused therapy is that really there are three major emotions that are often difficult for us. And they're often emotions that they're not difficult for us to experience, but they're difficult for us to work with. And that if we kind of let them run the show, they can be problematic for our well-being. So anger, for example, that we might have an angry response to life's traumas and tragedies. It's not. The point is not to say it's all understandable, and it's not. An important thing is it's not about saying, right, this is about trying not to feel these things, because that's just not realistic. That's not how it works. It's about how do we kind of go towards that and think about, okay, so how do I work with that to better support myself? So if we think about anger, for example, if you get very, very angry, what's useful to think about is, how is that affected my motivations? What am I motivated to do when I'm very angry? It's the same with anxiety. What am I motivated to do when I get very anxious? And sadness too. What am I motivated to do when I'm very sad? So anger might be a motive. I'm going to go out and have it out with them. Might be more kind of outward behaviors. Anxiety might be I'm going to just kind of curl away and just want to be on my own. Sadness might be, I don't want to be around anybody. And all of these things, as you can see, purely just from kind of looking at their motive, if we follow those patterns, they're probably not very helpful for us. They're probably likely to leave us feeling very disconnected and alone. Again, if we think about how our attention, where is our attention focused when we're angry, or when we're anxious, or when we're sad? What are we focusing on? What is our attention based on? What happens to our thinking? What are we thinking about ourselves or other people when we're angry, anxious, or sad? What happens in our bodies? Because obviously our bodies respond in a different way to when we're angry, we're anxious, when we're sad, as opposed to, for example, when we feel content, when we feel happy. So it's really useful to think about what happens in my body when I experience these things. What action do I want to take? What kind of memories do I think about? So for those of if you've ever kind of had a falling out, shall we say, with a loved one, when you kind of get very angry about it, you're probably thinking about things. Oh yeah, and they said at that time, and then they did it that time. So we're thinking about, we have a host of memories that come to mind that generally are of a particular kind. And the same, when we're anxious or we're sad, that the particular kind of memories of particular qualities that might come to mind. What's really important for us is, again, we can't stop these things. That's part of who we are. We have a capacity to experience these things. They're hardwired into us. But what can be really helpful, and where the compassionate self comes in, developing a part of ourselves that is compassionate to ourselves and others, that seeks to be helpful and not harmful to ourselves and others, is that what helps these things to settle. So when I'm angry, what helps me to settle? It's not about trying to push it away, but genuinely what helps it to settle. When I'm anxious, what helps me to feel better? What helps it to settle? How can I come down and start to feel a bit safer, a bit more soothed. And again, for sadness, what helps me when I'm sad? What helps me to settle? And of course, you'll I'm sure all aware that the problem is, without engage, if we don't kind of face and engage with these emotions, they're very difficult, of course, but we, sometimes these things become so overwhelming that we become quite disassociated and we'll avoid things, and we can be quite in denial. Maybe you can see problems of, if we get too overwhelmed with some of the challenges, that actually we're like, do you know what, I can't face anyone. I'm going to pretend this isn't happening to me. I'm not going to the doctors. I'm not going to the hospital because it's too much. I can't face that. And in the long term, that's probably that's very problematic. There's also says we might get caught up in a lot of, kind of envy. God, people got it so much easier than me, and why doesn't this happen to other people? And again, it's understandable, but that what that stimulates within you probably isn't going to be helpful for you. And of course, you might, become quite vengeful, or all of those sorts of things. So thinking about how we work with what we've got and how we help it to settle in a way that helps us, what is in our best interest. And one thing we say about the compassion itself is what it has our best interests at heart. What is genuinely going to be most helpful for me to navigate the path that I have to navigate. Okay, I'm just going to skip through that because so we're just about, I think, coming up to the nearly at the point. So another thing, I think, and this is the sort of takeaway page, if you like, what we would argue is that motives organize the mind, and therefore a compassionate mind training is about cultivating care-focused motives. So things that will support and nurture you and nurture your well-being. So again, it's so thinking about kind of the different emotion regulation systems, but thinking about motives, like what am I motivated to do? And so for, compassion, we would see that it's a motivation. It's a way of being as well. Like trying to live as compassionate life as I can. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. But we're motivated to seek to be helpful to ourselves and not harmful. And we're motivated to seek to go towards suffering and do the best that we can to alleviate and prevent it. So what kind of things can help us then? Well, this is all supported by a lot of research over a number of years, done by a lot of different people. So that's one of the beauties of being able to kind of take the benefits of, that we're building this collaborative, I guess, library of insights of different research that are all there to kind of, how can we best support people? So there's also using the body to support the mind. So this is why mindfulness practice is really is very popular, but also actually is very useful, because there's a lot of there's thousands of years of Buddhist practice, but there's a lot of research now that shows that actually mindfulness can really help us to settle our minds. It can really help us use our bodies to support our minds for all kinds of different reasons. So, and thinking about our posture, thinking about the kind of breathing exercises that we can do. Actually, breathing in certain ways can actually stimulate different physiological responses. Extraordinary. Think of things like movement, potentially yoga if you're into yoga, acupuncture. If it's just an example, you might or might not be interested in that. That's fine. Diet. We're learning a lot more. I mean, over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, we've started talking about the gut-brain axis, and we're kind of discovering that actually a lot of serotonin, so the sort of feel good, if you like, is in our gut. Extraordinary. So thinking that actually our gut health actually plays a much more prominent role within our health than we'd previously realized. So that's kind of really interesting. There's also thinking about how we might cultivate particular compassionate qualities. So, thinking about what are the key compassionate qualities that you would like to have for yourself? What are the qualities that you would like to have? What are the things that you would like to kind of work towards? Kind of, again, understanding that we've got tricky brains that we've got to work with. This is not our fault. We didn't design them. If we had, we might have designed them very differently. But we have to work with, to some extent of what we've got. So how do we kind of prioritize ways of being helpful and nurturing to ourselves rather than harmful to ourselves, even if it's unintentionally? A lot of things I think that we we can do to ourselves unintentionally. We're not intending to harm ourselves, but it's difficult, and again, developing the wisdom, the knowledge of what will help us best. And there's all kinds of different ways of doing that, but also, through community, from learning from each other, through supporting each other. How do we learn different ways to support ourselves from the experiences of people within our community? How can we learn and support each other? I think really, really important. Imagery. So one of the things that we practice within mindfulness practice, or other kinds of compassionate mind training, is kind of imagining what we would like to be, imagining what compassionate self was, also imagining our idea of a compassionate other. So who represents compassion to you? Who's a compassionate role model for you? What are the qualities that they have? How might they inspire you? And imagining engaging with somebody who is compassionate towards you, a being of some that has your best interests at heart. There's also the significance of kind of playfulness and joyfulness. So sometimes I think things are, some of the compassion stuff is sometimes seen as being a bit kind of very severe, and sure, there's a serious quality to it, but we also recognize that part of the soothing system is it is about resting and digesting and being soothed. But what we know is that when we feel safe, and when we feel in relationship with people that we care about, and we trust that they care about us, we are more open for playfulness. Playfulness and joyfulness are important parts of our relationships. Sure, you're familiar that your relationships are not all about having deep and meaningful existential conversations. Might be a part of it, but playfulness, joyfulness, laughter, humor are really important, and they stimulate some really good kind of stimulate good stuff in our brains, if you like. Again, one thing you'll notice with children is that children are, when children feel safe and they feel secure, they sometimes do that little look back just to make sure that mum or dad is still there. But then they're likely to engage in play and exploration. So how do we create the conditions that will enable us and empower us to be able to feel safe enough to be playful and experience joy? I know that in some a few people that I know really well have really got into this kind of moments of joy. So even just very kind of simple little things of just, whether it's a particular kind of bird coming to rest on your bird feeder, or, so whatever it is that kind of, these moments of experiencing a sense of kind of enjoyment or joy in the world can sometimes be really helpful. And again, playfulness, of course, is linked to friendliness and joyfulness. And then, of course, thinking about, practicing courageous behaviors, helpful behaviors and ways of thinking, and mindfully noticing helpful and switching to helpful ways. So another part of kind of mind training is also, it's not about trying to, again, we're not trying to kind of drastically change things, but it's more about how we can switch our attention. Okay, I notice I'm getting really anxious right now. I can feel that rising. Okay. So what's going to help me to kind of just switch my attention so that I don't start to get caught up and get looped up, and then I'm thinking about it and all of that kind of stuff. So how do we kind of break unhelpful loops is also really important. Okay. So I like this quote by Sharon Salzberg, who's a kind of very well-renowned meditation teacher. And she says that self-compassion is like a muscle. The more we practice flexing it, the stronger and more resilient our compassion muscle becomes. So there is a lot to be said about, the problem is that this isn't something that, okay, I can click my fingers and then all the benefits are mine to behold. If only it was that simple. A lot of, like everything, right? These things kind of take practice, and these ways of relating to ourselves, that's why we have kind of particular kind of training programs, but also that, that we practice. And, the vast majority of compassion focused therapists will tell you that their practice is continual. We're always working on it. It's not just something that we just kind of switch on one day and it's great. And the more we work on it, and the more I guess consideration and respect that we have for our potential for being compassionate, the more attention and cultivation that we give to it, the more that it will be there for us in times of difficulty. So I guess something, the final thing would be, how can I be helpful to myself? How might I work with rather than against my body? So what is it that I need? to support and nurture me going forward. And then there's some just a few resources here. I'm more than happy to send these to Adam if people want to kind of look at them. So we've got a number of guided practices on the Compassionate Mind Foundation site done by lots of different people. I'm all into different voices, and as a different voices, and we're kind of working on a new crop of those at the moment. Some of you might be familiar with Breathworks. I think Breathworks are a fantastic organisation who are specifically interested in working with pain, stress and chronic illness. So their founder, Vijayamala Birch, an absolutely inspirational woman who has had a very serious back injury for a number of years that has hugely influenced her life, and has learned, and she kind of shares her mindfulness journey and showing about actually how we can work with our minds to support ourselves even in the face of kind of chronic pain and stress and chronic illness. Some fantastic resources there. There's also the Self-Compassion app, which was developed by two colleagues of mine, Chris Irons and Elaine Beaumont, and that's available there. So that will help kind of support your compassion practice. And then, there's some books down here that for further reading that might be helpful for you. But thank you very much, and very best wishes to you all. It's been lovely to spend this Sunday. Yes, it is Sunday morning with you. That's my email and address. You're very welcome to contact me should you wish to. But I think that's about time. So thank you very much.